got a message from a customer saying he had penetrating damp. What had happened was, a gutter outside had been leaking and it had been splashing against this wall. Over the years, it had rotted this window and soaked through the brickwork because there's no cavity in this house. So the customer's chopped off all the damaged area, managed to loosen a bit more plaster, which I've just took off, and now we're going to fix this up. Don't add more than what is recommended because it weakens the sand cement.
Here's a little tip for you. If you buy your sand in bags, it's really easy to measure out. 4 bags of sand and 1 bag of cement is a 4-to-1 mix.
That's about the consistency you want. A little bit wetter than what a bricklayer would have it.
The timber window has been replaced and the walls had time to dry out. But now, before we put the scratch coat on, we have to wet the wall down again. This stops the cement drying out too fast.
Lovely stuff.
All I've added to the mix is Integral Waterproofer. That also works as a plasticizer, so the stuff's nice to use. Now, Integral, all that means is that it's mixed in with the mortar. If it was just waterproofer, you might get confused and think you paint it on the surface. Integral just means it's in the mix. Putting waterproofer in the mix just stops there ever being a chance of any more penetrating moisture in the future. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about Integral Waterproofer. All it basically is an alkaline soap of mixed fatty acids. And these fatty acids, they react with the cement, you see, and they form hydrophobic crystals. And what they do is they block up all the pores in the cement to stop the capillary action of water passing through it. Now, here's the interesting bit. You might be thinking, how did the chemical engineers come up with that? How did they know what fatty acids would do to cement? Well, a couple of thousand years ago, the Romans used to make a waterproof mortar to line the inside of their aqueducts and public baths with a mortar that was waterproof, and they used to use animal products like animal fat, milk and blood, which were all rich in fatty acids.
That's it, all cleaned up. That's the first stage done. So I'm going to leave that for a day or two and we'll come back after the weekend. So here we are for the second day. We've given it the weekend to dry out. We've got all our stuff ready to go now. Come on, I'll show you where we're up to. So, whilst we left this, what can sometimes happen is, especially if the bricks are really dry, is that as the stuff dries and the moisture's pulled out of it by the brickwork, it starts to shrink and split. Now, do you remember we damped the bricks down? So that hasn't happened, there's no splits, they look like little cracks. We haven't got none. It's perfect. So what we're going to do now is damp this down again and put another coat on. Right, what I'm doing now is just damping down the surface. Now, you'll notice I'm just dipping the brush in and brushing it on. And what's going to happen is the water's going to go on the surface and it's going to leave this little glisten where the water is. As soon as that glisten is gone, and it just looks a dull damp colour, like there, then you're good to start putting your next coat on. The reason I'm brushing it and not splashing it is because the waterproof is working the scratch coat, and I don't want to drown it and have water sat in the scratches. So what can sometimes happen is water sits inside these and they fill up with water. That's not good because it'll take too long to dry out before we put the next coat on. We are literally just putting a bit of moisture on the surface.
If your house was built after the 40s, you've more than likely got a cavity, so you don't really have to worry too much about penetrating damp. It only really applies to houses with a solid through wall. Now, going back to our ancient mates, the Romans, there used to be a bloke called Vitruvius, and he was a military engineer, an architect, and he used to advise a bloke called Julius Caesar, so he was quite a big deal. Now, he wrote 10 books on architecture, and in his 4th book, he mentioned about damp walls should have cavities. So I want to ask you a question. Do you think that we've invented modern technology, or do you just think we've recycled ancient technology? And also, what do you think of the buildings? Did they build them more beautifully than us, or do you think our modern architecture is better?
Okay, we're going to clean down all the edges, and then we're going to rule off. So the reason you're cleaning the edges down is because this sand's got a bit of grit in it. and it won't blend into the original wall, it'll only go up to it. So if you don't clean the edges down, you'll end up with bits of grit juddering and you won't get a nice straight line. And what you're looking for is any hollow sections. Just keep a bucket close by so you can just drop the stuff off. Now this is quite easy because I've got this wall to rule off, and as I'm going, I'm just going to fill any slacks in. Like so.
For the majority of this ruling off process, I'm using the wall that's already there. If you were plastering a whole wall, you'd rule off in a couple of different directions. I usually bring it up vertically, then horizontally, fill out the slacks as you go, then vertically again, and then horizontally again. After you've ruled it twice, you've usually got a true wall. Failing that, you could use screeds, but we'll cover that in another video.
Okay, now, when you look closely, you can see all the surfaces torn and open, especially if you know, look up here, see this? See how all that's torn? It's not smooth, it doesn't look like it's been closed with a trowel, like, come here, so you can see the texture difference. Come round and see that texture, right? It doesn't look like that, okay, see the difference? Now, the reason being, you want to leave that torn and open because the air will get to it. So when you've ruled it off, just leave it with the rule, leave it open. And when that starts to feel crispy, like we're going to leave this now, when it starts to feel crispy on the surface, that's when we're good to start going with the float. So we'll come back a little bit later on, we're going to leave it now to dry out a little bit. And when it feels crispy, we'll rub it with the float and put the key in, and then it'll be ready for skimming. Okay, it's been about 2.5 hours now, and that is crispy on the surface. So look, you can still make an impression in it if you wanted to, but the actual surface feels like dried out. So that's what you're waiting for. And then what you want to do is get your float. Now, these are just polyurethane floats. Okay, you can buy these from Screwfix, B&Q, you know, any tool shop. And all you want to do, you're going to turn the float into what they call a devil float. Now, mine, I've used drywall screws, and what happens is you want them to just stick through ever so slightly. Can you see them there? Literally just sticking through. And what you're going to do, when you rub the wall, those little screws are going to cause a key for your finishing coat to stick to, okay? You've got to create a key when you're rubbing sand and cement up. It's not so important when you're rubbing bonding or hardwall, but it is vitally important when it comes to sand and cement because the skim, the finishing coat, will just show off if you don't provide a key. Now, you can use nails. I prefer screws because as they wear down, you can just give them all quarter of a turn and they stick out a bit more. You don't have to have them in a row of 5 like that. For years, I just used to have one in the corner and that was it. And as I did that, it left like a nice little circle all over. But you just get a lot more done with more screws. You can put one in each corner. You can have one in one corner, or you can do a little row like that. And then all you're going to do is just go over the work like this. And what the float's doing, the float is knocking off any high spots and it's consolidating all the sand and cement. Now, if you want a big wall, you want to get into doing a figure of 8 motion like this. This is only a tiny little bit, so I haven't really got the space to be able to do that to show you properly. So I'm just going to make sure that everywhere's keyed. That's the main thing.
The idea is, on a big area, you work down the wall with a figure of 8, and then that way you're continuously leaving a key without rubbing it out at the bottom of the float. Slightly more difficult on little areas where you join up to walls, so the main objective is just to make sure you leave a key everywhere.
The float is knocking off any high spots, but it also gets a little bit of a build up around the edge. And if you get an area that you think perhaps is a little miss, a little hollow, you can take that stuff off and chuck it back in and work it into the wall. If you've gone to some older houses and you look at walls, maybe they've been built in the 60s or 70s, and you see little hairline cracks all over the walls, but the walls are solid. That's because the plasterer has come back the next day, like tomorrow, and skimmed over it. And it's lovely to skim over them because it's still damp, so you've got no suction. Now we can't do that because it causes those little splits. As this sets, it shrinks. We're going to leave it for the day and come back the day after.
We've come back 2 days later now. I'm going to scrape off all the little snots off the wall and we can start skimming. The cement has had time to shrink and dry out, so this would be a nightmare now if there was no waterproofer added in it.
This SBR, the part of the wall we're going to blend into, we don't need to see all the sand and cement. It's got waterproofer in it, so that'll be fine. It's got a key and it's got waterproof to stop the suction, so we'll be fine to just skim straight onto this. Let's begin.
Now, before you do this, it's a good idea to test the sand and cement. Give it a little flick of water and see how fast it draws in. Now, I did this and it stayed damp for ages, so I knew that the waterproofer was working. If you find that there's loads of suction, it's a good idea to give the wall a good drink first. Damp it down, damp it down. In fact, keep damping it until it won't drink any more water, and then you're good to start skimming. Otherwise, you'll have a nightmare of high suction. But we haven't got that because I've used the maximum amount of waterproofer. There's no suction with it whatsoever. To avoid the cost of waterproofer, and also to avoid the problem with the suction, this is what some fellas used to do in the past. They would skim it the next day when it was still damp. But as I said before, that cement still needs to dry out and shrink. And as it shrinks, that's what causes those little shrinkage cracks. So preferably the day after is good to go. It's just a case of trying to catch it right where the shrinkage has occurred, but it hasn't fully dried out yet. Skimming is one of my favourite aspects of plastering. Now, if you'd like to spend the day skimming with me, there's still a few spaces left on the Plastering Experience Day. Just click on the link in the description and book yourself in. Come and spend the day in Liverpool with me skimming. That ceiling is curved into the walls with a line painted straight. So rather than skimming everything, I've decided just to blend in. Now, the process that I'm following when I'm skimming is always exactly the same. I give it 2 coats of plaster, I flatten it in once, I trowel it with water twice, and then I polish it. It's always the same process no matter what I'm working on. I don't use flexi trowels, I don't use any other trowels, I just use the same carbon steel trowel from beginning to end.
Now look at this. See this, we keep cleaning this down in between, but the customer Tony's got a nice big architrave that's going to cover over all this once it's finished. So I don't really have to be so fussy up around here, but it's still nice to do a nice job for them, you know, even though it won't be seen.
Now, before we mentioned a little bit about the Romans, and ultimately it was the Romans and the Greeks that brought about our classical forms of architecture. Now, I don't know if this is interesting to you or not, but the Victorians took it to the next level. And maybe if you like this sort of stuff, in the next videos we could talk a little bit about what the Victorians did and the speed in which they used to build things and the quality of the buildings. But we'll just see. It might not be your thing. Now, just off camera, what you didn't see, at the same time as skimming this wall, I had 4 patches and another wall on the go all at the same time. So I was running around a little bit trying to get everything done all at once. You know what it's like? The customers always say to you, oh, there's just this little bit here and this little bit here if you wouldn't mind for us. But ultimately, it was a great family to work for. So that's it. Job done, all polished. Hey, we'll see you on the next one.